Hey, Allison, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate you taking the time.
No, thanks for having me, Brian. I'm looking forward to learning how this whole plumbing thing works.
And thanks to everyone who's joining us online as well. What we're going to go through today is a conversation that Allison and I and some other leaders in supply chain have been having really over the course of the last year around the changes in the way that companies are starting to think about their supply chain systems and how those systems extend outside of the organization, and how as we look to build more resilient and sustainable supply chains, that we need to start thinking about the nervous system of how data moves and where the connectivity is inside of our organizations and with our trading partners more holistically. So I've asked Alison to join us to sort of help us talk through that and really bring a different perspective to the conversation as we go through and look at some deeply technical issues in a relatively non-technical way. So Alison,
Yes,
again, thanks so much.
that's all right. Take pity on the lawyer who, still working out the React buttons on Zoom.
So Alison, do you want to maybe give everybody a little bit of your background and kind of what role you play in the industry?
Absolutely. So I started off my career working as an in-house lawyer for the Australian arm of the CMA CGM group, so the carriers. So I have seen deep within the belly of how things work and also what happens when things don't go according to plan, which is why I'm a big proponent of it's not a matter of if your supply chain breaks, it's a matter of when your supply chain breaks. And then after about 6 years, I was like, you know, the industry is consolidating and it seems a little, easy to win. So I'm going to go out on my own, start my own law firm and switch sides. So as my old work would say, I've gone to the dark side of cargo interests. I realized that, there wasn't, there's so much knowledge that's out there that's not being tapped. And there's so many different ways to hack the system without even engaging with anyone else. And so this is why I love chatting to you about this, because you look at systems and processes from an IT side, and I look at systems and processes from a risk decision making process. So we're very much aligned in our philosophy and attitude about holistic supply chains, because you can see, for me, it's where does your controllable risk start and stop? And for you, it's what data can you control, and then what's happening to your data once it's left your sort of metaphorical gate, I suppose.
Awesome.
So,
So why don't we dive in a little bit, and I'm going to bring up this slide and talk about it for a minute. And then what I would like to talk about is where some of the things that you're working on actually fit into this slide, as a little bit of context. And we'll use that as a stalking horse for sort of some of the bigger concepts in here, so we can be maybe a little more specific as to how people can apply some of this, because it does get complex, as this slide might indicate. So this is a map that we did along with a customer of the various different business processes that they had inside. In this case, it was a 3PL. You could make a very similar map for the supply chain systems and connectivity inside of a shipper, a carrier, really anyone in the industry. And what's interesting to me in this is that the actual movement of freight execution is this little box here. And there are all of these other business processes that sit around them, right?
yeah,
And as we started talking, one of the things I realized is that sort of the legal and insurance and liability and all of those components isn't even in this map, right? That wasn't even something that came up in the context of the conversation, right? But what does come up is the fact that everybody has a map that looks like this. So whether we're sitting with a customer who's, a 2, 3 office freight forwarder sitting in one region of the world working just with agents, or whether we're sitting with one of the global top five, or we're sitting with, a major US retailer or a startup, they ultimately still need to know things of where's my freight, and am I being paid for it, or am I paying properly for it with my freight audit program, or how am I handling LCL versus FCL and making those decisions? That these problems exist everywhere. And what we see is that the number of systems you may have to solve these problems is very different in different companies. But the decision factors as to where you're going to invest really all start from a map that looks something like this. And maybe just for everyone's context, if you explain a little bit about the app that you've built and kind of where that fits into the world of this, we can then use that to maybe refer back to through the rest of this conversation.
Yeah, so I built an app to deal with cargo claims because cargo claims are so sexy that they cannot exist in a normal system that everyone buys because you just can't handle it. So, so you said legal insurance and risk isn't on this. I bet you cargo claims are like even further, it's in like the fifth dimension of non-existence. So I built an app that um, forces, and so I built it for myself, for my law firm. So I do cargo claim recoveries, and I was like, I'm not wading through data. I haven't got time for that. I'm busy. So I built an app that captures all the data I need as a lawyer, but in a UX way that makes logical sense to the person inputting the data. So it's little things like what's the bill of lading number, who was the carrier, what were your port pairs, what was damaged, and where is it now. But what the end goal is, in a world domination sense, is that we have that internally and externally for certain organizations. So if say you're a stevedore and the carriers are like, you damaged my box, force them to give you the information they want. But as they're doing it, you can pull data from other systems if you need, and then ping things off in a variety of manners at the same time. So you can ping off to your ops for cleanup, you can ping off to, your notice of damage, you can do your claim requests, but it also puts in a lot of information in terms of my experience into who shouldn't claim. So a big thing in you'll know this from your forwarded days. There's so many people invested in one container moving from port to port. There's so many people invested, but not all those people have the right to sue, and not all those people have the right to claim. So it's a filtering mechanism as well. So what I did was I took all that kind of nebulous stuff and then put it into essentially a chatbot with all the information, but it's very rigid. So you can't, if you want to step outside of things,
Right.
you out.
So then within that context, I think one of the things that was interesting was when you and I started talking about that app, what became immediately apparent was that even though that app likely sits somewhere over here along with billing and accounting and sort of the financial components, that the first thing you approached Chain.io about was, oh, we really need to connect to freight visibility solutions because we want to validate that that container was on that ship and that that the person didn't type in the wrong vessel name and sort of all of those things, so we get that data clean. And then the second thing we're probably going to want to look at is who actually owns the cargo that's inside that container, and is it how, if we're looking at it from a carrier perspective, knowing and being aware of all of the, not just necessarily who they booked with, but also is there PO management data as far as who ultimately is the BCO, or even two steps down, right, that this container is going to be handed over to another party who might be a huge customer.
Who needs to know? So
Right.
often when things go wrong, so you got the 1A person, containers fall off a ship, and it's like, yeah, but who actually needs to know? Not who gets to know, who should know. And that's normally 3 steps down the line. And if we could speed up that data transfer, you wouldn't have people going, did my container fall off the ship? And everyone's I'll let you know in 4 to 6 weeks when we count the boxes.
So
We'll get back.
so one of the interesting things there then is that when you're looking at your burgeoning software company inside of your law firm,
Yes.
right, that there is a profile of a customer that is very good for you, and there's a profile of a customer that wouldn't be so good for you, and some of that is sort of overlays the map of where their priorities and their strengths are as a company and from a system standpoint, right? So if you have a company that essentially is the lowest cost operator and doesn't ultimately is just like, we're just going to pay the claims because we just want to move it through, and we don't care if it's inefficient because we're just trying to do volume, right?
Yeah.
Versus a company that may be a very white glove uh,
Mm.
3PL who says, hey, look, when we're handling it on the inland move, all of our customers are high end, or we're in pharma, or we're in whatever the case may be, and therefore we are going to invest in systems like what you're building because it is extremely important to us that we are very quickly able to notify our customers and understand the impacts and really do that work, as opposed to somebody who just sees it as a cost center, right? And
And
that
that's
having
a
that conversation is important.
that's a really key point, because I talk about with my clients, I said, it's not about when things go right. When things go right, the systems in supply chain is built for when things go right. They are not built for when things go wrong. So in Australia, we have last mile, which is a massive problem. If you can solve it in Australia, you'll be, beating out Jeff Bezos in terms of cash. Because if your package can't be delivered, it just spirals off into the Netherlands of like, where is it? I don't know. Maybe just, oh, it's lost. Like they know it happens all the time, but they haven't built for it. And it's about, and I think that's perfect about, your client profile is, well, do you want to be someone when something goes wrong, you get the white glove treatment? It's like, we have sorted it, we're under control. And you're like, oh, good. It's like when you pick your insurance companies, right? For your car. You either have the one that's going to be painful and you're just banking on the fact nothing will ever go wrong, or the one that gives you the replacement car, looks after you, gets your car done, and you're like, oh, this was so easy. This was so easy. It sucked that it happened, but taken care of. And that's what I think people don't think about.
So, so one of the things that we coach our customers on, from a service provider and from a shipper standpoint, is to sit down and look at this map or their personal version of this map and decide consciously, what are the things that we want to be good at? Are we that low cost insurer, or are we the white glove insurer? Or are we the company that focuses very, very deeply on things like PO management and product masters and 4PL control towers? Or are we the company that focuses on getting the best rate every time, right?
Mm.
And that across an organization, and across, whether you're, again, two people sitting with an Excel spreadsheet and that's your TMS, or whether
Mm.
you're a global 50, 30,000 employee 3PL or a carrier, you can't be good at all of them. Nobody can, right? And so that decision factor is really the first thing we look at with nervous systems, so that you can then sit down with someone like Alison and say, okay, you have this product for claims, and we've already decided that we don't want to be great at that because we want to be great at something else. So therefore, we can qualify each other out in a relationship very quickly, or no, 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 we've decided that's extremely important to us and we have really good alignment. But what a lot of companies don't do is this first step of saying, what am I going to be great at? What am I going to be average at? Which might be these things in the blue. And one of the things I'm not going to do at all, right? So I don't do e-commerce as a company, right? As a 3PL. I don't do warehousing. I only do international moves, or I only do trucking. And therefore I can just gray out certain things, right? I don't do, export clearance.
Yeah.
Um, those then make it so much easier to talk, not just to your software vendors, right, to the Allisons of the world, but also to the shippers, and have a conversation vice versa that says, you as a shipper value having the cheapest provider. We're not the cheapest provider. We are the most white glove provider. Or you as a shipper value having that extremely white glove service and expect us to be able to customize to your crazy PO and product master requirements. And we're not really that good at that. And then from the shipper perspective, being able to go back to your customers and ask them those questions in a or your vendors, I'm sorry, in a very meaningful way, and say, okay, we are a white glove company. Show us your IT systems and where you've invested to prove to us that you understand that we're a white glove customer or company, because certainly the salesperson's going to tell us that they are, but the investment in IT is a much deeper spot into that.
Do
So
you do you think people are actually having these conversations and sitting down? Because I've gone, to enough freight forwarders websites that we're like, we are the number one logistics provider. And I'm like, you can't all be number one. Just firstly, right? Like that's like every country town in Australia has won best pie. And I'm like, awarded by who? But do you think that there's, I mean, we know the shipping industry has a lot of egos, right? We know it has a lot of egos. Do you think it would be an actual point of difference if a freight forwarder or solutions provider came out and said, we love to do this. We nerd out for that. We invest in that. Like this is what we love to do. We also do this, but this is
So
our unique selling point.
so I think the answer is yes, but you have to look at it in sort of through the right lenses. So
Mm,
what we're seeing, or what we've seen, is a few things. First of all, if you look at the smaller providers are actually very good at this because they don't have a choice, right? And they're actually very good at saying that this is what I'm good at and this is what I'm not good at. What they are not always great at is sort of what we're going to get into the next slide, which is then investing in alignment with what they know they want to be good at as a business.
yeah.
When we look at the larger companies, to some effect, the larger companies do kind of want to be good at everything. But this is where the responsibility falls a lot to the BCO and to the shipper to say, okay, show me instead of telling me. Show me that you're good at this. And don't show it to me by giving me a demo. Show it to me by showing where you're investing. And saying, of your total investment, where are you putting your money? What are you building? What are you delivering? Because it's much harder to, the money sort of clarifies everything, right? And the investment sort of clarifies everything.
Put your money where your mouth is, essentially, right?
Exactly.
Like
Essentially, yes.
if you meant it, you do it. And do you think BCOs and shippers know they have this power? Because I know they feel very powerless at the moment.
We are hearing from our customers, our 3PL customers, that these conversations are starting. I know that when I was selling in 3PL, we would occasionally get into these conversations, but oftentimes we were starting them because we saw this as a strength, right? We said we had a very, very strong PO management platform that we had built. And I'm going to jump to the next slide because it'll sort of explain
Yeah.
that what we realized when I was in 3PL was that we were a small to mid-sized provider at the time, and we could not afford to build everything,
Mm,
nor did we see value in building everything. And what we had identified in our particular case was that we were going to be really, really good customs and regulatory and PO management and upstream vendor and all the things that were related to the compliance pipeline, right? So
mm,
that's everything from purchase order to factory audit to QA, all the way downstream. And if you needed us to move freight, we were in NVOCC and we could
yeah.
move your freight, but you were never going to choose us as the best NVOCC in the world because we didn't have better rates than everyone, and we
Yeah.
it wasn't our strength. And what that led to, and that's really the key in this graph, is we said there's a lot of suites out there, large systems, right? The big brand names in the industry, and then there are a lot of individual point solutions, the modular systems, and there's more and more of those popping up every day. And you read about a startup getting funded. You go to FreightWaves or Journal of Commerce, and you'll see a startup announcement every day of the week. Um,
Yeah.
and So what we decided was we could invest in a large suite for the things that were not that important to us, right? So NVOCC, freight forwarding as a sort of the baseline cutting of airway bills and all of that. Billing was not that important to us in the sense that obviously we wanted to get paid, but we weren't going to do it distinctively different than everyone else.
Yeah.
So we
You
were
were
able
like,
to put
oh, yeah.
money and just go buy a tool. One big tool does all of that. And
Yeah.
then we carved out the things that were important to us.
Yeah.
And this map is actually from a different customer, but it sort of overlaps that we said customs and regulatory was extremely important to us. In our case, PO management was in this box. And then there were a couple of things that were so important to us that we said we have to build them. So we had the best tariff classification and free trade agreement management software of any 3PL on earth. And we were confident of that because
Yeah.
we had built it. It was as good as, what an Amber Road would be selling for large sums of money, and we were effectively giving it away to our customers because that was our hook. So we had very few things that we had built. We had a larger suite of things that we had bought that meant we did the best denied party screening. We were using best of breed there. And then a big box of things that were just the things we had to do in order to be in business. And
Yeah.
so
So
if you can
if
get your provider, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, like, for people, I'm coming at the layperson being
Mhm.
like, am I thinking the same way? So when you talk about like your buying your suite, it's like your like your Zero or your QuickBooks or whatever to do your billing, or whatever the just
Mhm.
hey, can I buy it? Can I buy a monthly or yearly subscription? Right, like your Zoom. If you need to
Yeah,
have
or your SAP,
yeah,
right?
or
So
your
anywhere along that scale, but it's
small.
the thing that does all the things.
All right,
Right?
so it's
So,
your kind of like
and so in our industry, from a freight forwarder perspective, your big names in that space are, the CargoWises, the Descartes, the Magaias, the
yeah.
Solo Plans, Rigas. There's lots of them in
Yeah, I just
different
want to make
regions of the
sure
world.
that I'm like
Yeah.
keeping track. Because what the only thing that popped into my head as well when you're talking about that is that I know companies that have built really basic stuff as a
Mhm.
stopgap. And then what the companies do down the track is like, oh, you have to use this and then make it. And they're like, that was never the point, and it's not that good. And you don't like you're trying to now use it for what it was never
And
built for,
and so
and
we
then
see
invest otherwise.
yeah, we see two kinds of companies in this upper left quadrant that I've empty, which is build the suite. So the first one is companies that are, I think, what we would now categorize as digital forwarders.
Yeah.
And that actually, the concept has been around longer than the term, but it is the idea that you have decided that you consciously decided, I'm going to build an end to end thing because what I value and what I can provide to my customer is a holistic experience. That I want my customer to have one very consistent user facing experience. And the way I'm going to do that is by building everything top to bottom. I think there's very few companies that have the resources today to start there. The other are the companies you've talked about where 20 years ago or 15 years ago or 30 years ago, there really wasn't as much choice in the marketplace. And so they ended up here because they had the mainframe, and the mainframe just got kind of forced into everything. And what a lot of companies can do today that are in that spot is start carving off little bits, not retire the mainframe, but start thinking about it as if it was in this top right, that almost like it's a third party system, and then buying the pieces where they want to be special.
Well, see, this is really fascinating because I've actually lived through just
Hmm.
two massive SAP rollouts,
Hmm.
and I think the do you see a disconnect between where senior management is like, yes, build me a suite, we're going to be the best at everything, this thing is going to be a one-stop shop, it'll do everything amazingly, and the frontline staff are like, it
3 years
doesn't.
ago, yes. 5 years ago, definitely. 10 years ago, without a doubt.
Yeah.
Um, I think most people in the C suites today understand that there's a huge amount of value in having certain pieces of your solution be unique. We've talked to a lot of customers who use large platforms, and then their customer facing presence is the same as everyone else who uses the large platform,
And you're
or
like,
their
what am I?
billing presence is the same, and they want to do something better around cash collection. You're going to
Yeah.
say, oh, the large platform doesn't take credit cards, and we want to be able to take credit cards, right?
Yeah.
Whatever the case. So there's lots and lots of different spots. So you can go all the way back here and say, where do I want to be better? And then I think executives are getting better at saying, okay, yeah, there are spots where we don't just get to go to the board and say we're writing one check and we're done with our problems forever. I don't think anybody's that naive anymore. There were certainly we were, and I'll include myself in that. I mean, there was times in the 90s and in the early 2000s where that was the best knowledge we had. We've just come a long way as an industry since then.
And the other question I have is like, is the message, because I mean, I'm building this like, I'm building a really niche product
Hmm.
for a really big problem because no one wants to touch it because they're like, ugh, cargo claims, why? Stop. They don't exist. Shh. And but what I'm saying is it the message? Because I think everyone's like, but how do they talk to each other? Because I want them all to integrate and I want them all to talk to each other, and I don't want to have to like shift data and like pick it up and like put it in, because that's when you get double handling and that's when you get errors. And I know in Australia the government's looking at a single window, because at the moment I think they clocked it that the same piece of data has to be entered into 57 different systems.
Mhm.
And I'm like, not surprised. But is that where Chain.io comes in and just goes, I just have this vision of you, at the big board with Benedict Cumberbatch, where he's like doing the Enigma thing, and you just plug it in all the wires, and you're like, yes, decoded,
Yes.
works.
I was wondering which Benedict Cumberbatch movie we were going at there for a
Not
second.
Doctor Strange,
Not
but I
Doctor
mean,
Strange.
it's
We turned
still.
it into Doctor Strange. So yes. Yeah. So I'm going to go back a slide and then forward a slide. So yeah. So what you're talking about is the fact that really in any of these business processes, you can dig down into anything here and probably find that in a larger company, you might need 10 solutions under each of these. So this 54 might turn into 540 ultimate solutions. And everyone in that ecosystem needs to understand that they are part of an ecosystem. But not
Mm,
everyone in that ecosystem needs to understand the whole ecosystem, nor can they. And that what we look at and where it's important that we have this conversation first is we sit down with CIOs and executives at these companies and business line executives and say, don't make sure you don't have 50 systems behind freight audit if you don't really care about freight audit, right? Because that could happen because locally in that department, they really care about freight audit, right?
yeah.
So have some of this rationale, but then once you start digging, you end up in something like this. So you say, okay, we've decided freight visibility is really important to us.
Yeah.
And so we're going to build a freight visibility solution. Underneath that, there are lots and lots of systems. So you're going to need carrier connectivity. You're going to
Yeah.
need dray provider connectivity. You're going to need, one of the many, many, many ocean visibility platforms that are out there to buy from today, or trucking visibility platforms, or and rail. And then what does visibility mean for an order management level, right? So it's one thing to know this container's here, but what's my available to promise on the product? So once our customers make that decision, then what we can help them with is saying, okay, your IT department is trying to build the best visibility solution, but they don't want to spend the rest of their lives integrating with all these suppliers, especially because by the time you get to the finish this, you're going to decide that there's a whole new drayage provider that has better visibility, and you're going to want to swap one out. So it's a moving ecosystem. And behind every one of these post-its is a map that looks like this. So that's when we start talking about the nervous system, is that it has to self-heal, that when you decide to change your business and priorities and you're shifting these things, that you need to very, very quickly, each of these dots can't be a year, right? You have to very quickly be able to move things in and out, or the business shifts and you say, hey, I'm going to move freight allocation management down from the suite into something specific because we've realized that contracts situations have changed. And
And
how quickly can I accommodate that? That's where Chain.io, by making these integrations fast and having one connection to your suite,
mm,
makes all of that much more agile. So,
and this really comes back to your point about asking the people who you're working with, where are they investing so that you can be agile, because you're getting the information, because the data doesn't stop at your door,
right.
and
So,
you want to have that sort of back and forth. And if you're not asking the right questions of your suppliers, then how do you know where they're at in alignment? Because if they have a different alignment and you're spending all this time and effort banking on them, investing in a certain thing that you need, and then they're like, oh, what? No, that's not important to us. And you find that out, over a beer at the end of a conference, and you're thinking, spend a year banking on the fact that they're going to do that for me, but I never bothered to ask. And is
right.
that when you say to people, it's worth asking the question, and it's not. And do you think it's telling as well if you ask the question and it's kind of like a sputtering,
Well, I think you have to have a little bit of patience. I think that they are hard questions.
yeah,
And I think the first thing I would say is that most shippers are probably not really good at asking the question.
Mm.
And so you really do need to have a meaningful conversation, right? And, if you're talking to a smaller provider, often the person who's sitting in the room is the person you can have that conversation with.
Yeah.
If you're talking to a larger provider, it is really acceptable to say, hey, we're going to have this conversation, but I'm not going to spring this on you, because
Yeah.
not everyone in that organization is going to be able to have it. So I think it's the point here is not to do a gotcha, or not to even say, like, I'm going to put it in the RFP and I'm going to immediately disqualify them if they fill in the wrong thing, right?
Yeah.
So much as to say, hey, we asked you what your top 5 IT priorities were, and you gave us this list, and we didn't see this on here. Are you also investing in there? Because they may have just missed, right? But
Yeah. No.
ultimately, you're going to have a map like this. They're going to have a map like this. And if there's a good overlay, then you're
Mm.
going to be good partners. And if the priorities are completely out of whack,
Yeah.
then you're not. And that's a good thing to know, and sometimes you're not, but they're cheaper and you're still going to do that, right? But I think a lot of us have learned that that's not the right decision over the last 24 months. So,
Well, it comes down to cost and value, right? They're different things, and it's about if you need to. I'm always a big believer in making informed decisions. So I say to my clients, hey, you can take whatever risk profile you want. You can have like massive amounts of risk exposure or a little amount. That's your commercial decision. It's your business to take on whatever risk you want.
mhm.
But I want you to know that you're doing it. And it's the same for this map, right? You can be like, yeah, hey, we are so misaligned, but for whatever reason, I still want to work with you. And you're like, that's great. But at least you go in knowing that this might be a short-term relationship, or down the track, it's going to become apparent where the friction points are. And
or
you know,
don't come back to me in a year and complain that my warehouse sucks when I told you that my warehouse sucks,
but
right? And
it's
that warehousing is not what we do. Like I can recall specific instances at forwarders where we had a CFS and our customer really, really wanted us to have a proper distribution center. And so we were using 2,000 square feet next to an airport as if it was a distribution center for a customer. And then
yeah,
they were upset that we didn't have piece level scanning. We said, well, we don't have piece level scanning because we're at CFS, that you're wedging us into being a distribution center. And they were doing it for reasons because they found great value in us in other areas.
yeah.
But we were very clear with them we were not making an IT investment there, and that they had to deal with that to get the benefits that we were bringing them, on the fact that, like in that case, we were saving them millions of dollars by optimizing their free trade agreements. And that the fact that there was a little inefficiency in the warehouse was a perfectly valid reason to still save the millions of dollars on FTAs.
And that comes back to holistic,
Mhm.
doesn't it? Holistic, because we see silos, right? Like we see silos in businesses where you do even talk to each other, like what is the main objective, and is that where the businesses have to step back and say, right, on a holistic start to end, what is the value I'm getting out of this relationship, and is that value good enough for me or what I want? Because if they'd stepped back and said, yeah, but like we are saving millions of dollars because they are really good at that, and we can take the pain, or the crap, the little crap part that, yeah, it's like daily death by 1,000 cuts, but then you step back and you look at it and you're like, yeah, but I like the millions of dollars in my pocket. So is that where we need to be empowering? And I think empowering is the right word, right? Because you want to empower people to go, yeah, this is great. You should do this map. You should work out what it is you are really good at or you want to be really good at. And then that's your true north. And that's where you should be heading. And then once you know your own backyard, then you can have conversations externally. Because I always advocate this for my clients. I'm like, do you even have visibility of your own supply chain and your own processes and your own systems before you then start getting grumpy at other people for their lack of processes and systems? And I always say
I
to
think
people,
what you just said about knowing your own backyard is probably the most important thing,
hmm,
right? In the sense that, we talk about this as a nervous system. And if you everyone's nervous system is unique, and it's going to be like a fingerprint. And it is going to be, it's not something you can really lie about. It is who you are,
hmm,
right? And you don't get just to will it to look differently. right? Like you can't just, it's not, there's no level of marketing that's going to change me into, somebody who's 6'4". It's not a thing. So knowing who you are, knowing where you're investing, being confident in that and doing it in a conscious way, and then prioritizing your investment to who you want to be and saying, hey, I do want to be a professional athlete and I'm going to go to the gym, or no, I'm going to be a computer nerd. So I'm just going to sit here in this chair and talk about supply chain all day. That's a conscious decision, right? But you got to kind of map out what's important to you. And I think, if we're going to leave anyone with a thought here, it's know your own map, know where your priorities are, and know how you're going to make sure that you are very effective in connecting all the pieces in your green boxes, and that how you've invested in being good at your blue boxes and ignoring your gray boxes, right? And that if you can do that for yourself, then you can start doing it with your customers or with your suppliers. But everyone has to look at their own backyard first, or their own nervous system, before they start looking at everyone else's.
Yeah. And having the confidence and being comfortable and saying,
Yes.
yeah, I don't do that. And I'm perfectly okay with that. And I'll happily tell you I don't do that. It's not my priority.
So Alison and I have a tendency to wax philosophic, and I think if we keep going much longer, we will get down a very deep hole. So I think this is probably a really good spot for us to wrap off before this gets completely off the rails.
Yeah.
But again, very much appreciate everybody listening in today, whether live or on video later. And you can get in touch with us at Chain.io. And if you want to connect to Alison, she is. I don't know how well saying she's on Clubhouse is going to age over the next few years of this video, but you certainly find her on LinkedIn and on her corporate website. So all right. So thank you very much, everyone, and thank you, Alison.
Thanks.